But in Acts 17, we see a really interesting example of contextualization with Paul talking to Paul's approach on the Areopagus. But let's talk a little bit before about how Paul goes into the synagogues. What is his approach in the synagogues?
Yeah, that's a great lead-in, because I think one of my favorite things in the book of Acts is to compare the three sermons that Paul preaches to non-Christian audiences and show how each of them expresses the good news, but it does so in a very different way, each one tailored to the audience that Paul is speaking to. So in chapter 13, Paul is speaking in Pisidian Antioch, the town of Pisidian Antioch, to a crowd of Jewish people and Jewish sympathizers, and his setting is the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue. And in that case, his point of contact is a shared story. And basically, he tells the story that they all know, the story they're a part of throughout Hebrew history. And he uses a lot of scripture references from the Old Testament. And he shows how Jesus is the Messiah that the prophets had foretold, and that he was the one that came out of David's line in order to fulfill God's promises to Israel. And when he gets to the end of that sermon, the end of that speech, he says, okay, and now I'm going to tell you that God has raised this Jesus from the dead, and he can give you justification, and he can give you forgiveness of sins. And all of that language and that whole approach was very much tailored to a Jewish audience, and it really fit the context. But then one chapter later, he goes to Lystra, and he and Barnabas are in a very different context. And their audience there is some probably uneducated Gentiles, people who are polytheists. They believe in many gods. And you remember that there Paul healed a lame man, and those people automatically assumed that Paul and Barnabas were Greek gods who had come to earth, and they started to try to worship them and offer sacrifices to them. And Paul says, no way, stop that. And his point of contact there, instead of a shared story, it's a shared humanity. He says, we are humans just like you are. And then he goes on to talk about the gospel there, but he does it in a very different way, because instead of talking about Jesus as the one who fulfills the scriptures, he starts where they are, and he talks about the God who has created all things, and the God who has cared for human needs with things like rain for their crops and abundant harvests. It's the kind of stuff that these uneducated Gentiles would understand. But at the same time, he confronts their idolatry head on, and he says, the good news means that you need to turn to this living God and away from these worthless things. And when he talks about their whole pagan religious structure, their worship of the various gods and the practices that support that as worthless things, the gospel and Greco-Roman religion collide. And they see that they can no longer continue in the path that they are on. And so the worship of the God collapses when it is confronted with the good news in that case. In Acts 17, and that's what we're getting to, there's another audience. And this is another Gentile audience, but a very different one than we saw in Lystra. This is an audience of very educated people, Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, and the elite of the city. This Areopagus was the supreme council, the governing council in Athens. It was their job to decide on religious matters. And Paul's point of contact with them is very interesting, because he has gone through the city, and I really like this about the description that Luke gives us here, that Paul was very observant as he was looking doing a tour of the city. And he's noticing all of the idolatry that's going on. He's noticing all of these pagan temples in Athens. And so the point of contact there is he says, I noticed that there is a temple to an unknown God. And probably that was a kind of safety precaution for the Greeks. I mean, in case we've missed one of the gods, in case we've missed somebody that would get mad at us if we left him out or her out, we're going to build this temple to the unknown God. And Paul says, yeah, I've seen that temple to the unknown God, but then he uses that as a springboard for the main thrust of the sermon, which is this God has made himself known to humanity. And so even though that sermon is deeply rooted in the Old Testament and in Jewish thought, he expresses it in language that these Gentiles, and particularly these philosophers, can relate to. And he uses terms and concepts that Stoic and Epicurean philosophers would have been very familiar with. For example, he says that we are all God's offspring. We are in kinship with God. Well, that's language that the Stoics could have connected with. And instead of quoting the Old Testament in that case, Paul actually, to support what he's saying, cites their own Stoic poets. He doesn't go back to the Old Testament scriptures. He cites their own poets. But it's not just about common ground, because Paul counters the Stoic and the Epicurean teaching in that sermon as well. And for example, the Stoics had this principle where they believed that there was this divine reason that was behind the world and behind all things, and is very impersonal. And God says, no, this is a personal God, and he is the Lord of heaven and earth. And then he confronts their idolatry head on. So in this case, Paul recruits the very language of these philosophers in order to transform their worldview and their culture. And he ends the sermon by talking about how God has raised Jesus from the dead and he is going to judge the world. Well, those were concepts that were very, very strange to a Greek audience. In fact, the idea of someone being bodily raised from the dead would have been both disgusting and ridiculous to many of the Greeks. And yet Paul does not water down the gospel. He doesn't change it in order to make it more acceptable for the tastes of the Greeks. And so in each of those cases, in each of those three sermons, you see this beautiful example of Paul contextualizing the gospel for his audience. The good news is consistent, but it is expressed and it is taken in very different ways for each of the audiences.